Team consistency. When I think about team consistency, there are two thoughts that come to mind. First, I'm thinking about the team members themselves and keeping them together longer. I'm sure you've heard that that's generally a good idea. It takes people time to learn about each other, to integrate with each other, so you might need to leave them alone for a while for them to understand how to maximize their productivity, at least a handful of sprints. Now, while I do agree with that idea in general, I have seen many cases where it made sense to move people about between teams. In one example, this was an environment where all of the teams, while working for different product owners, were all familiar with the overall domain. They all had similar skill sets. And there were times when it did make sense to pull one person out of one team, move them to a different team, take someone else from yet a third team and bring them onto that first team. And we would do that almost every sprint. And it worked out just fine. Now, you could argue with me, oh, but Peter, they could have been so much better if they stayed together longer. Possibly, but we were in an environment where the production work itself, what we had to produce, was clearly more important for the immediate time frame to get the work done, to get it completed as soon as possible. And sometimes moving people around will allow that to happen. Another environment where I've seen it helpful to move people around has to do with environments where there are concentrations of skill types or domain expertise that are needed for a particular phase of a project. That might last multiple sprints, but then once you start moving into this next phase of the product work, it also might make sense to pull a couple of people out of that team and now add a couple of additional team members that have that particular skill that might be needed for that particular phase of the product work that we're in. Now, the other thing that I think about when considering team consistency has to do with reliability, has to do with what they can produce in a given sprint. Now, I'm intentionally not using the word velocity here because velocity in itself is just measuring the output. I'm interested also in the outcomes. Here are two areas that I'm trying to understand about my team regarding their consistency. How well do they finish the work that they planned for the sprint? And how well do they achieve the sprint goal for that particular sprint? That's where I bring in my 85% rule. As a product owner, I need a team that can produce in a fairly reliable manner so I can plan. Now, if I do not have to plan beyond the next 1 or 2 sprints, then maybe this wouldn't be a concern. But if I do have to plan multiple sprints out, it's going to be helpful to understand what am I trying to accomplish here with my team? What type of reliability would allow us to plan further into the future? Here comes the 85% rule. I need my team to first hit 85% of the deliverables for any given sprint. So they bring 10 requests into the sprint. If they can deliver on average 8 or 9 of those items per sprint, for me, that's a solid B plus. And I can plan with a B plus delivery team. I can't plan for a C minus delivery team. It makes it much more challenging to do that. So I do not expect my teams to deliver 100% of every item that they bring into the sprint every single sprint. I think that might be a little unrealistic, and it could also indicate that maybe there's something about the team environment that's withholding them from moving forward and actually producing more. The other 85% rule has to do with the sprint goal. How often is my team achieving the sprint goal? If they can achieve the sprint goal about 85% of the time, again, I'm probably going to be happy with that. I could use that 85% B plus delivery consistency to plan my goals, all accumulating towards the product goal in question. Now, here's an interesting situation. What if you have a team that only delivers 50% of the work that they brought into the sprint, but they achieved the sprint goal? Now you could have an unusual situation where your team is not hitting the 85% mark in terms of output, but they're hitting the 85% mark in terms of outcomes. Now, I don't mean to make a blanket judgment on that to determine whether that's acceptable or not, but for my product owners, I'm going to ask you to consider what's more important for you. Hitting all of the requests, volume, in other words, velocity, in other words, output, versus sprint goal, outcomes. That will be for you to decide, but I hope that it's at least part of your evaluation methods as you are inspecting and adapting.